Hello, everyone, and welcome to today's talk on how we can make better decisions in avalanche terrain by having better conversations. I'm Dr. Justin Borowski. I'm a professor of communication and also the researcher who's been developing this model over the past several years. And specifically, the model that we're going to talk about today is the PEACHES model. PEACHES is an acronym for all of the things that we talk about when we are making a decision in avalanche terrain. It's a strategy that we can use with a ski partner or in a group or in a search and rescue team or any avalanche mitigation professionals when they're exposing themselves to more hazards. So let's go ahead and get into it. You can picture yourself in this position that we've all hopefully been in before. We are at the top of a beautiful slope. We've just had a great tour, great day in the mountains, and we're getting ready to begin this descent. And when we do this, when we make this decision whether to enter into avalanche terrain, we're going to have a conversation with our partner or our team. And that conversation, we are making really potentially life and death decisions right in that conversation. And there's things that are happening there that are opportunities for us to improve on. So I like to call these things the popcorn problems. And when we are making decisions, often as a group, how we go about that is that topics just pop up all over the place, right? We should do an ECT. What about that test slope? The weather, right? We kind of just like bounce around and pop up like popcorn. And and there's some problems that kind of come from this approach. The first is that it's really hard to take what we know and translate it into an action, right? We might know a lot about these topics and be able to pop them up at certain times, but we don't know how they fit into a bigger decision-making process. The other thing here is that when we do this, we're not mitigating these heuristic traps. We know a lot about heuristics and how bad heuristic decision making in avalanche terrain can be, but we are not necessarily mitigating them at that time. And then the last thing is that this is potentially really disorganized. And when we have these disorganized conversations, it's really easy to miss things. So getting into how we use the PEACHES model is we begin with the letter P and we work our way through the model, right? Each letter will have a topic, and we can use this at a decision point, at a transition, when we're going to change aspects, when we're changing objectives, or really any time that you feel like you need to check in with your partner or group about the bigger picture. And the other thing here is that the model will take a little bit of practice to get used to, but once you have it down, it should be able to be completed in just a couple minutes. And we often utilize this at the point where we're doing transitions. So this is the PEACHES model. The topics here are pressures, expectations, arguments, consequences, heuristics, everyone speaks, and strategy. And you'll see here that this isn't just a list of topics that you talk about, but rather it is organized in a very systematic way to help support your decision making, right? To help improve decisions making in groups. So getting into the first step is pressure. And here we identify any factors that are pressuring the group to make a decision, and we work to fix those. And this could be the weather, right? Maybe it's colder and you're freezing on a ridge line, or maybe it's much later in the day, or maybe you've been in a situation where you are trying to rescue someone. And I've been there personally, where you're trying to rescue someone in avalanche terrain. They're yelling for help, and your instinct is just to go, go, go. But you can't do that at that moment because you don't want to expose yourself or your team to more hazards. So the first step in making good decisions in avalanche terrain is to talk about pressures and work to fix them. And you might say things like, how are you feeling? Or it's really windy here. Let's go duck behind these trees. Or even just checking in about how your timing is. So the first step is pressure. From here, expectations. And here you're going to discuss what the group expected to find and then what you're actually seeing. Right? You're kind of checking your mental model that you've developed for the day against reality. And this could be wind loading, it could be new snows, temperatures, right? This list would go on and on. But the idea here is that you want to identify things that are different than what you expected. And those are the things that you want to talk about and pay attention to, right? If you didn't think it was going to be really windy and you get out and you see signs of wind transport, that changes what you should focus on during this conversation. So some examples of what you can say, wow, there's definitely more new snow, or there looks like there's a weak layer, right? Bring up the things that are surprising to you that don't fit your mental model or your group's mental models. So we've mitigated our pressures, we've talked about our expectations. Now we're getting into the argument stage. And here we are kind of arguing two different ideas. The first is that we're arguing that the slope will avalanche, right? We are arguing that it is unstable. So we're going to bring up whatever things you think indicate that this slope is going to slide. And here I didn't make an extensive or exhaustive list because you want to be able to use whatever evidence you think is important for the group at that time. The key thing here is that as a group, you start and you have a discussion and everyone contributes whatever evidence they have that the slope will avalanche. Once you've exhausted that, then you all shift as a group and talk about all of the reasons that it's not going to avalanche. So you're kind of responsible for making both cases, right? You're going to make a case that it's going to slide and make a case that it's not going to slide. And what this is doing, and this is important that it's structured in this way, is that it helps mitigate some of these heuristic traps. Right? People can want to socially conform to the group and not necessarily be a party pooper or bring up concerns or be Captain Safety at the moment. And by saying, let's all talk about why we think it's going to slide and then why we think it's not going to slide, it gives that person a voice, right? And it keeps anybody who might be a little bit overzealous from dominating the whole conversation at this point. So incorporate that structure, right? Will avalanche first, will not avalanche, and then bring up the alternatives, right? You don't have to get too far into them, but just make sure that you do identify them here. So we've gotten into our arguments that it's going to slide and then it's not going to slide. And then we can talk about our consequences. So how big is the avalanche potentially going to be? What are the terrain traps? And we can balance this consequences kind of in relation to our last step, which was the arguments, right? If we think that the slope could slide and it has really terrible consequences, that's going to inform our decision making as a group. Same if we think that this slope isn't going to slide and the consequences really aren't too bad if it did, that is going to inform the decision that we make. So our consequences are important to talk about. And some examples, right? If it slides, we would be okay as long as we're here. Or if it slides, it would be huge and, right, not something that we'd likely survive. So you get into the consequences. And these are kind of the spots in this process where groups will sometimes say, you know what, you'll sometimes make a decision already. Right? If you come up with all of these reasons that the snow is unstable and likely to slide, and then you identify that you have high consequences, right? That sometimes is enough to be like, we're done. We're going to choose our alternative. Totally okay for that to happen. So if you get through your consequences, everybody's happy, then you check in about your heuristics, familiarity, acceptance, right? You know them all here. So we don't need to go into them. But just make sure that you have brought them up and they aren't dominating your group's decision making, right? You might have them as part of your arguments, as part of your evidence, potentially, one way or another, but you don't want to make a decision based on that. So make sure your group isn't falling into any heuristic traps. And then you will go around and everyone speaks. And this is another important step in mitigating any of these heuristic traps. You want to hear everybody's voice, everybody's concern. And you can do this in a couple different ways. You can be kind of informal and say, what do you think? And what do you think? And what do you think? And make sure you go around and talk to everybody. How are you all feeling? I say, let's do this. I've seen other groups who will say thumbs up or sideways, I want to talk more, or no, right? It's all about you and your group's right dynamic at that point. But the key thing is that you go around and everybody gets a turn to have an input here. So if you've gotten to this point and everybody's feeling good about things, it's unlikely to slide. The consequences are acceptable. It hasn't been dominated by group heuristics or dynamics. Everybody feels good. Then you come up with your strategy. And this is the last part of Peaches. And here you just develop your exact strategy for skiing that slope. So identify your trigger points, spacing, islands of safety, right? If you're going to use a rope to do any avalanche mitigation, right? Here you develop your exact strategies. And this is a funny one for me because I personally have had good friends who I've been skiing with for a decade, and we go out and we go through this model and we get to S, and we were envisioning totally different strategies for skiing the same thing. And so it was really good to have that conversation, even with a partner who you know really well. So some examples, we could ski one at a time, or don't ski past me, right? Identify any potential stopping points. So now we can kind of go back to that slope we were looking at the beginning of this presentation. And rather than just saying, how do you feel? Right? Is it good to go? Now we have a whole strategy that we can use to have a conversation and pull all of our evidence and information and decision making together. Right? We've got a lot stronger of a tool to make a decision. So this model, Peaches, lets you turn that knowledge into action. Right? We give it spaces to talk about, and then we make decisions from it. We can mitigate these heuristic traps. We utilize some of these best practices in group decision making, like arguing that it will avalanche and then that it will not avalanche. And then lastly, it keeps us organized. So we're making sure we get to cover everything that we need to, talk about what we need to, and that voices are being heard. So this is our Peaches model, right? Pressure, expectations, arguments, consequences, heuristics, everyone speaks, and strategies. And what I would encourage you to do is to write it down, right? Put it on a water bottle. That's what I do. Put it in your snack bag, put it under the lid of your pack. Just have it somewhere where you can pull out, and having that physical reminder to have this conversation is a really powerful tool in actually accomplishing it. So hopefully this has been helpful for everyone. Please feel free to reach out if you'd like to talk more about this, and stay safe out there. All right, take care.